You know, I gotta tell you guys, the hardest thing about filming these intros is trying to get the whole damn sword in the frame. Really, really annoying. Looking at a 2-inch viewfinder from about 15 feet away. I think you get the idea. Let's do this. Alright, so let's work on the pommel. If we look at my source pictures here, by the way, if you are a Berserk fan, this sword appears starting around chapter 57 or so, and I don't know exactly where it ends, at least the mid-60s, so it's in the story for quite a while. Now the pommel is basically just a huge chunk of hex with a hex-shaped spike on it, and the backside of it is just flat, as you can see. So got some pretty good pictures here. I'm gonna make this 2.5 inches wide and a little more than 3 inches long overall, I would say. And given that this doesn't have any particular orientation, I am just going to thread it and thread the handle, and then they'll join together right there. So it should work out pretty well. Given that this is a pommel with a spike on it, clearly it was intended to possibly have some sort of offensive use, so I'm using fairly tough steel. This is chromoly 4140. It's about twice as tough as normal mild steel, and it is heat treatable if it comes down to it, just to have the option in the future, but I don't think I will for this project. All we gotta do is lop off this little chunk, and then we'll bring it over to the milling machine. I think that'll make this project pretty easy. Alright, here we have it. Just scotch-brighted it a little bit. It looks pretty good, I would say. The spike came out just about perfect in my opinion. All the lines seem to converge basically perfectly in the center here. This is actually fairly sharp, so I got this little tiny drawing that I'm using for reference. This is actually the highest quality one, but you get the idea. I think it looks just about right, proportions and everything. Kind of a stubby little end to it, but it works out nicely. Okay, let's work on the handle now. We're gonna take this 1.25 inch stock. I'll cut it to size, and then I'll hit the lathe, and we'll thread the end of this to match with the end of this. Alright, let's see how we did here. Looks pretty good to me. I'm going to semi-permanently install this with some red Loctite, some thread locker, and that should stay on there more or less forever. By the way, that chunk of a pommel weighed 3.5 pounds, if you can believe it. This thing is already at least twice as heavy as the normal sword, and I've only got the pommel and the handle done. Alright, so we've got the blade steel in. This is a pretty serious chunk. It's 5 inches wide, 66 inches long, and it is a 1/2 inch thick. It's pretty serious. Now, I kind of cut a lucky break here. This piece came to me nearly perfectly straight. Let me stand it up on its side and I'll show you here. Now, it's really hard to show these things because the camera doesn't really want to focus, but as far as I can tell, it is very straight. I'll put it down and I'll stick the level on it. Now, this piece of paper is probably around 4 to 6 thousandths of an inch. I can just fit it under in this very small section, so needless to say, this thing is as straight as it's going to get. Any attempt to try to fix any little imperfection is probably going to make it worse, so we'll move right on to the next step, which is marking out and cutting out the blade. Now, this sword actually has a very slight taper to it. It's really hard to see, and in fact, in some of the drawings, it doesn't appear to be tapered at all. But I would say in the majority of the time, it has a very, very slight taper towards the end. I'm going to start at 5 inches wide, and I'm going to neck down to 4 inches wide at the other end. So it's not a whole lot. Let's get this all laid out, and I'll show you what I mean. Well, there we go. I'm not sure how well you can see the scratch marks in the blue dye there, but it looks pretty good to me. Got a nice subtle taper towards the end, and I've got the tip all marked out. Alright, let's rough cut this bad boy out, and then I will hand sand to the lines. Alright, we are on day 2 of the cutting and grinding. Now, full disclosure, I totally underestimated the amount of work this would be. I think I just decided it looks kind of small, so it would be easy, but it's by far the longest sword I've ever made. This is 6 inches longer than the biggest Dragonslayer I have made, and it's also twice as thick, so the total amount of grinding to get these edges done is hilarious. I actually ended up overheating the motor to my sander 4 times, and I completely ruined an angle grinder just to get it to this shape. As you can see, I have not actually come right up on the line. It's got a small gap. I can't really tell if the camera's focusing. There it goes. So I just had done so much grinding, I was so tired of it that I'm going to use the milling machine to mill a straight line all the way down both sides, and I wanted to do it in one pass, so I needed to leave a small amount of material, but not a huge amount, and overload the machine basically. Alright, so I've got the blade loaded up in the milling machine here. Now what I'm trying to do here is line up the line I scribed earlier with the movement of the table, so that when I start milling the edge, I know it's a nice straight line and it's in line with my intended marks basically. I don't really know of a better way to do this, so I'm kind of doing this hokey thing where I put a little countersink in the milling machine here. I don't know if you can see this very well, but I've basically got this lined up perfect right in the middle of the line. I'll back it off a little bit, and now I'll articulate the table to the other extreme. Alright, now we're at the other end, and I've just moved it a little bit so you can see what I'm doing, but it looks like we're right in that line again down here, so I just have to do this multiple times. This machine can only articulate 32 or 33 or 34 inches in each direction. So I'm actually going to have to do this twice per side of the blade, and then once more for the tip, which has a different angle on it. So it'll be 6 different setups. I'll do this kind of sketchy manual aiming thing, and hopefully it comes out alright. And yes, I did move the milling machine. You can see the marks on the floor that I marked out where it was before. I needed to angle it slightly so that I could stick the sword right out the door here. Hey, whatever it takes, right? Alright, we are in the home stretch. I'm just doing the final cut. It's just this short little piece for the tip of the blade. I actually had to move the milling machine again the other way so that the blade could make it out the garage door. It's good enough. Alright, the machining for the basic shape is completely done. We've got a hell of a nice finish on here. It's almost a mirror finish, even though this was a roughing end mill, which leaves these little lines here. I don't know if you can see these horizontal lines. But, resetting up the milling machine in the middle, you can see this is the spot right here. Yeah, I screwed up a little bit, just the tiniest bit. You can barely even see it. I say that's less than 0.010 of an inch. And the other side... The other side is more of the same. There's 2 little marks here, but they're very faint. I did a little bit better of a job. I would say either less than 0.005 of an inch. You can't even see where they are. All in all, though, I would say it turned out pretty well. I've taken measurements, and I'm basically perfect on everything. So let's get to work on the fuller for this bad boy. Alright, so I've got the fuller all marked out. It is 2 inches down this end, and it necks down to 1 inch at that end. The bevel part of the blade's 1.5 inches wide, and the fuller follows it the whole way down. It gets actually quite narrow down here. I'm not going to rely on these lines for my actual machining. I just laid this out to make sure it looks the way I wanted it to look, and to just give me a visual reference while I'm machining to make sure I'm not radically screwing up, because I already have multiple days into this blade and I really don't want to mess it up now. Now, given how thick this blade is, if you remember, it is 1/2 inch thick, which is completely insane. It's the thickest sword I've ever made. I'm going to remove the vast majority of the material in the fuller, right about 75% of it, so I'm only leaving 1/8 of an inch of material, and it will be plenty strong enough. I mean, this bevel section is very thick and very wide. It'll provide more than enough support for the blade, so I'm not worried about it at all. But this blade is still very, very heavy, and given the length, it's just going to be almost impossible for anybody to pick it up. So I want to remove as much material from the center as possible. Now I'm going to be using 2 tools to cut out this fuller. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the edge with this. This is a ball nose end mill, and you can see why it's called a ball nose end mill. It's got a hemispherical end on it. I'm just going to do the border, and what that will do is it will give me a nice rounded radius all along the edge. It just looks better than a straight, up and down profile, basically. The second tool I'm going to use is one of these guys. Now, this is what's known as an Indexable End Mill. It's just like my other cutters, but it has replaceable teeth. You can see it's got 3 teeth on it. I've left one of them out so I can show it to you. It's right here. This is a trapezoidal insert. It's just a little piece of carbide with that really fancy coating on it to let me cut this hardened steel. And this is it. I can actually use these twice. I can just flip them around and then use the other side. And then once I've destroyed both sides, I just replace the teeth. So it ends up being fairly economical. Still very expensive. Each one of these little things is like $12 or $14 versus replacing a large end mill over and over or breaking one accidentally. It just makes sense. I'm going to use this thing just to hog out the rest of the material in the center, kind of mass material removal. It'll be nice to have that little slot all on the edge done first, so it'll allow some clearance for the chips. When this thing's chewing up the metal, it'll give a little bit of room and hopefully extend the tool life. So, alright, so we've got this bad boy mounted up in the milling machine. Now, I don't know how interesting this is going to be, so I'll explain it very quickly. I need to get the nicely machined edge of the sword lined up with the travel of the table, so that way when I'm cutting, it's cutting exactly parallel with the edge of the sword and this line. That way this thickness stays perfectly consistent. So what I've done is I've taken this guy. This is a dial test indicator. Every graduation is 5/10,000ths of an inch, or half a thousandth of an inch as it's commonly called. That's 10% the thickness of a sheet of paper basically. So every graduation is very, very, very small. Now I've got the little tip here touching the edge of my nicely machined surface, and all I'm going to do here is traverse the table left and right and make sure that the indicator doesn't move, or at least not very much. So I'll start it right now. I think I would call that good enough. Alright, so we've got the fuller all done here. Or at least as far as the machining goes. I will clean it up later. I do need to clean up the tip of this as well. I don't have any cutters small enough to really get that angle. I'll do that manually later. What I am going to do right now is I'm going to use, this is a 1.5 inch face mill, and I'm going to attempt to take the bevel off, just the tip over here. I'm more or less just an experiment to see if this is going to work. I don't know how much stress this is going to put on the cutter, the machine, so forth. So just a few inches, and if it works out, I'll do the whole tip. And if that works out, then I'll do the whole damn thing instead of just manually grinding this bevel. As you can see, we've got 1/2 inch thick material, a lot of material to remove, and it's 66 inches long, and I have to do both sides. So you get the idea. This is a bit of an experiment. We'll see what happens here. Alright, so here we are. It obviously worked out quite well. I got a pretty damn good surface finish on that. And I'll take a look at the cut. You can see, oh, hang on. So you can see I've marked a line. This is the midway point. This will be where the edge of the blade is. And I was a little conservative. Let's see if I can get that to focus. A little conservative. I left a little bit of meat on this so I can shape that by hand and put an edge on this thing. And you can see in the top I did the same thing. Right there where it should have gone into the fuller almost. I left a little bit. There's two reasons for that. Number one, I didn't want to overshoot. It'd be very difficult to add that amount of material back on. And number two, I wanted some amount of flat surfaces left, because if you think about this, as I bevel the edges down, I'm not going to have any way to clamp this flat. So by keeping a small flat lip along the edge of the fuller the whole way, I'll be able to clamp this down and keep it secure the whole time. Even if I run into major trouble and I can only do the tip, that's just fine. The tip is really the most annoying part. I'd have to hold this 5.5 foot long blade at a certain angle to get this tip correctly. And since the material is so thin as the blade tapers down, it's very easy to overheat it as you're grinding it. And then getting all these angles correct, where the angle of this meets the angle of this and you get a nice little line right here, also very difficult. So just doing the tip alone would be a huge time saver, and I think it would look really awesome. I could do the rest by hand if I really had to. Well, needless to say, that experiment was definitely a success. I think I got it perfect. We've got this line just down the center here. Just a little bit of material left on the edge. Not too bad. I think I'll just do the whole bevel this way. It'll save me some time and it'll end up perfect. Well, that's it. She's all done. Fresh off the milling machine. It came out pretty well, I would say. Not perfect, but I had to, reset this up in the machine, I think 30 times total. So every time I set it up, there's a little margin of error. And you can see right here, for example, this is where I had to move the blade after doing roughly half of it. And you can see all the defects, so forth. But they're not too heavy. I'll bring you in closely here. You can see they just they're basically just visual. You really can't even see much of a lip. That one actually does have a tiny lip. I'll sand that out. Came out pretty well though. I'm pretty happy. It's amazing how light this thing is. I'd say we've removed well over half the material. I'll have to weigh it later. All that weight has to go somewhere. And it's all in the form of chips on my garage floor. I think I'm gonna have to sweep this up. I don't think this is gonna work very well. 3 trash bags of chips. Anybody need any? These would actually make a cool art project if they weren't so hard. But maybe someday I'll do something out of some mild steel chips. Let me get this thing all sanded out and perfect, and we'll see what we end up with. Well, boys and girls, that's pretty much it for now. I just took a few hours and kind of sanded it. I did about 95%. It still needs a little beautification and sharpening, but I'll do that when the entire sword is actually all together. I think it turned out pretty well. Probably 40 hours of work, I would say. I went through a lot of extra effort to have a sword that tapers, but given the length, you can barely tell. It kind of looks, you can see it sometimes. It seems like when you're at this end, it looks like it's pretty much just a straight sword. You can maybe barely tell. On the other hand, I was reviewing the reference material in the manga, and sometimes you can barely tell that it's tapered either, so I guess it's just the way the sword is. This is actually one of the shots I'm talking about. Obviously this is a bit of a forced perspective, but you can really not tell that there's any taper to that blade. Hey, if you like this kind of video, I only do a few of these a year. You may want to subscribe right here. That's it. Thanks, guys.